India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who was on a two-day visit to China, met Chinese President Xi Jinping on the second day in Wuhan city after yesterday's meetings, and stressed on resetting bilateral relations that were strained in the backdrop of the Doklam crisis. Earlier in the morning, the Prime Minister resumed one-on-one talks with Xi Jinping. It began with a walk around the East Lake, and then they took a boat ride. After the informal summit, for which no agenda had been set, Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale highlighted various issues which were discussed by the two leaders. In the press briefing, the Foreign Secretary said that India and China will work towards points of congruence. Peace and tranquility will be maintained at the border, and strategic guidance will be given to the militaries of both the countries, along with confidence-building measures which are expected to come up in the near future.
Bilateral trade and investment formed an important part of the discussion. The two leaders underlined that trade should be balanced, it should be sustainable, and that we should take advantage of the complementarities between the two economies to enhance our trade and investment. Question, the two leaders endorsed the work of the special representatives in their efforts to find a fair, reasonable and mutually acceptable settlement. And the two leaders also underscored that in the meantime, it is important to maintain peace and tranquility in all areas of the India-China border region.
The Foreign Secretary also pointed out that the two countries will promote tourism and people-to-people contact. Soft diplomacy through films will also be promoted. Apart from this, a cooperation in climate change talks, sustainable development and counter-terrorism were also discussed by the Prime Minister and President Xi.
President Xi Jinping actually said that he had seen a number of Indian films, both Bollywood and regional, and that it would be a good idea to expand this, that more Indian films should come to China, more Chinese films should go to India.
Earlier on Friday, the two leaders held delegation-level talks where the Prime Minister emphasized on making such informal summits a tradition. The Prime Minister also invited the Chinese President to India next year for an informal summit. Apart from the lunch today, and the Prime Minister will be on his way back soon, President Xi Jinping also hosted the Prime Minister for a lunch after the informal meeting between the two leaders. And while details of the menu are not immediately available, we do have a picture of the menu card which had the Indian tricolour with a peacock motif in the center, signifying the attention to detail that has been paid by the Chinese hosts. Former senior diplomat Ambassador Arun Singh continues to be with us. We are also joined by Andrew K.P. Leung, an international and independent analyst. We saw that peacock on the menu. Apparently in one of the tables where they were drinking tea, also there was a small peacock made out of sugar. So the symbolism is there, but big takeaways after the announcement by the Foreign Secretary?
I think several takeaways. One, you spoke about the symbolism, the optics. But for a visit of this nature, the optics is very much a part of the substance, because the signaling that comes out, and the signaling that has come out, as was being projected from earlier, is that the two leaders are meeting for extended, candid discussions, almost 6 hours of talks. So they would have covered in detail a whole host of issues to work out the new framework and paradigm for the relationship, both in the bilateral, regional and global context. Because clearly the India-China relationship has gone through some challenges over the past year. The relationship framework between India and China has changed. The global context has changed. So with this new global context and China's expanding footprint regionally and globally, what should be the new parameter for the relationship? So I'm sure they went into those issues, and new guidance will emerge from there, as has been indicated, to the militaries, to maintain peace and tranquility all along the border, and for other established mechanisms to see how they can enhance areas of bilateral cooperation given this new framework. So the real test will now come in the subsequent months as these mechanisms meet and deal with the various issues related to trade, where we have a major deficit. For example, one of the references was by the Foreign Secretary that multilateral financial and political institutions should be reformed. What does it mean for the UN and the UN Security Council? So these are all aspects that I think the existing mechanisms will now grapple with, and only, I would say, 6 months, a year down the line, we will be able to assess what the real significance was.
Mr. Leung, if I can bring you in, how is your assessment? Of course, the big takeaways or what the effect of this will have, as Ambassador Singh is pointing out, will take some time. But the idea here was for the two leaders to get to know each other, and this is not going to be a one-off. They're going to have more such meetings.
Well, apart from the optics, I think we have got to understand why this urgently organized informal meeting. It reflects a new way to address international relations, bilateral relations, and indeed the world order. I think the hidden message is more important than the optics. I mean, we have talked, endlessly about the optics, but the hidden message, which is left unsaid, is that what do you mean by allies, and what do you mean by enemies, and what do you mean by rivals? Well, look, for example, the so-called, and of course, America prides itself on so many allies, 70 allies around the world, and China reported to have only one ally, which is North Korea. But is North Korea a real ally for China? Yes, of course, it depends on China, but also it depends on South Korea, it depends on the United States, and it depends on the rest of the world. Secondly, if we talk about the ally, one of the allies, a very staunch ally of the United States is the United Kingdom. Look at the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. And in spite of the warnings from the United States, the United Kingdom was the first one to jump out and say, well, hey, I'd like to play the game. So this informs a kind of mindset that the old mindset of a zero-sum game is either me or you. If you gain, then I lose. It's really out of date. The whole world is so interconnected. So I think this is the hidden message to India. Now, India, of course, is a non-aligned nation. Of course, it is a relationship with the United States. Of course, it is part of the so-called quadrilateral, QUAD, with Japan, Australia, United States, and India, as perceived to be containing China. But it's not. It's not a deliberate kind of a foreign policy of India to target China. As I said, the India is a non-aligned nation. So I think that this informs the both countries how to treat international relations, how to treat bilateral relations. Of course, there is rivalry. Of course, there's conflict. But then instead of focusing on these issues and using a zero-sum game kind of mindset, which only leads to
lose that zero-sum mindset. Mr. Leung, just interrupting you there because we're getting in pictures now as the Prime Minister is boarding his special flight and is leaving Wuhan. He's returning home after 2 days of that informal summit. Ambassador, again, when we're talking about that, this is going to become the norm rather than the one-off. Now, we presume that the Chinese President has accepted that 2019 invitation. Now, that's going to be either slightly before the general elections or maybe after that.
So, well, I mean, it's norm in diplomatic encounters, including of this kind, to extend an invitation, and then to extend an invitation in principle. And then dates are subsequently filled out. So it's quite possible that it happens early in 2019, and sometimes calendars get filled out. So we'll have to see. But I think the message is that both have agreed that this is not a one-off exercise. They would like to continue with it, and that they would like to reinforce. And another point I'd like to make is that although the formal announcement of this informal summit was done just a few days before the summit, as the Foreign Secretary himself hinted in the briefing, to some extent the discussions of this kind of an event started at Xiamen. when they said that we look at the relationship in a forward-looking manner, we'd see how to take it forward. And a couple of months ago, there were already stories appearing in the media hinting that there are going to be 2 meetings and that there would be a visit early and followed by the visit for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So I think both countries, both sides, have been planning for this for some time. To deal with the negativity and the adversarial nature of the relationship that was perceived and to set a new context.
Again, Mr. Leong, sorry for interrupting you last time around when you were getting those pictures of the Prime Minister leaving. You were talking about how there has to be a change in mindset from a zero-sum game. I was just looking forward to the next time that these 2 leaders will meet, along with, of course, the other heads of state of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. These 2 leaders would have discussed issues that will come up and will be part of the joint declaration then as well in June.
Oh, naturally, because if you look at the history of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it was founded by China and Russia as a kind of counter-terrorism organization when the September 11 kind of thing was happening. But then it eventually blossomed into kind of a multi-dimensional kind of platform, engaging the Central Asia economies as well as other stakeholders, including Pakistan and of course including India. Whereas India has always been pressing for a proper seat in the as Shanghai Cooperation Organization. This did not happen at first, but now the dynamics have changed. I think that China is now switching to a kind of trajectory whereby it wants to engage all the nations, and then of course is embracing a kind of multilateral, kind of multidimensional, a kind of win-win kind of situation, rather than, as I said, the zero-sum game kind of mentality. Gone are the days of the Cold War, because with interconnectivity, with mutually assured nuclear destructions, it doesn't make sense, to coerce other nations by nuclear power or aircraft carriers. No matter how powerful you are, you just can't do it because of asymmetric kind of reactions. Look at the ISIS, even though it's not a nation, it's dragged down the most powerful countries in the world for a long, long time. So I think that this is a new dynamic, a new paradigm. Connectivity, e-commerce, artificial intelligence, they see no borders. And of course, nations are always rivals in a way. They are competitive, but that doesn't need to translate into confrontation on all fronts. So there are many ways to manage international relations. I think this informal meeting sets the scene and clears some of the air.
Collaboration and not confrontation, you're pointing out, Ambassador. One point, a few years back, Indian foreign policy had the stated position of de-hyphenating India and Pakistan. Has that been actually achieved over the years?
I think it has been achieved to a large extent. And at that time when the de-hyphenation was being looked at or talked about, it was more in terms of how US was defining its policy. And when it looked at India, it also looked at policy related to Pakistan. So I think since the US-India Civil Nuclear Agreement of 2008, that de-hyphenation has in fact happened. And the US relationship with India is of a completely different level and kind compared to the relationship with Pakistan, which is focused much more on issues related to terrorism, what's happening in Afghanistan, whereas the relationship with India has a far deeper context in terms of economic cooperation, technological cooperation, defense cooperation, the people-to-people dimension with 3.5 million people of Indian origin in the US. So that de-hyphenation has happened. And it has also happened because the level of our economic development is very different, and people around the world see Pakistan as a major problem country because of its involvement with terrorism. So in reality, it's certainly happened.
Beijing is, of course, an all-weather friend. Mr. Ling, just getting you in on, you were talking about the Islamic State now. There is an affiliate even in Afghanistan and possibly in parts of Pakistan as well. When it comes to terror, have you seen Beijing or China shift its stance a little bit vis-a-vis Pakistan, at least in multilateral organization groupings in the declarations? They have mentioned Pakistani-based groups, Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, and even in the International Organization for Terror Funding, they are now in the grey list because of Beijing's position.
Well, I think that in spite of the rhetoric, in spite of this informal meeting between the two leaders, India and China, China is unlikely to ditch its partnership with Pakistan, because, as I said, China doesn't embrace this kind of Cold War bloc kind of mentality, a kind of zero-sum mentality. But on the other hand, Pakistan has got problems for China as well. I mean, the terrorism, which can threaten the very stability of the Communist Party, the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, because they occupy a huge tract of the Chinese territory, almost 1/3 of China. Even though the number of people are relatively limited, but it's still a huge kind of territory, and then involving a lot of energy, resources. So for China, terrorism is a very, very survival-threatening kind of a threat. So it's partnering with international organizations, including the United States, terrorist funding, and of course in the areas in Central Asia, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. And obviously, China does not buy terrorism. But on the other hand, it doesn't buy the idea that with using the military is the only toolkit is going to solve all the problems. I think that China still believes that economic development, bringing the opportunities for the people, changing the dynamics of certain countries
Right.
which are threatened by safety, including North Korea, is the answer. So I think that this is going to happen in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, embracing more countries, support more countries, including India, but also focusing on real projects that is going to bring economic benefit and peace in the region.
Yeah, one of those projects is a joint collaboration on an economic project in Afghanistan. Andrew KP Young and Ambassador Arun Singh, thank you so much for sharing your views with us. Well, let's also get a view in from senior Indian journalist Atul Aneja, who spoke to Palki Sharma Upadhyay in Wuhan.
I have Atul Aneja here with me. Atul, what more have you heard?
Well, there's no detail which has come out except the official, an official source saying that for the first time, India and China are going to do a joint project in Afghanistan. You can well imagine that I would say it's a seismic event because that's one of the hotspots of global geopolitics. And the signal which it sends to the regional countries around, both on the Central Asia-Russia front and perhaps more importantly to the Pakistan side, I think it is symbolically and otherwise a very major event. Even on the international scale, we have heard, I mean, President Trump has declared a renewed interest in Afghanistan. So how do all these countries manage a common approach towards Afghanistan? And will they be able to manage it is going to be a big question.
We'll be doing that military drill later this year, and we are going to be meeting at the SCO summit. But what I want to understand, and this is very, very important, as you yourself said, it's a seismic event. The fact that India and China are going to collaborate on a project in Afghanistan. What the contours of this project will be is still far from clear. This is just an idea. It's just germinating as an idea at the moment. But how does that impact what India is already doing there? And how does that impact the situation? And in what form are we collaborating? Is this an infrastructure project? Is this CPEC with another name? Is this BRI with another name?
Look, there were genuine concerns about China's role in Afghanistan, the growing role of China, because, when you had one form of diplomatic dialogue and there was a military mechanism as well between China, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Tajikistan, which had started in Xinjiang in 2016. Now, it was a worry for India that would Afghanistan become a place where Pakistan and China would collaborate on the ground. And there were also stories about China establishing a military base or helping Afghanistan establish a military base in Afghanistan in the Wuhan corridor. So China's profile, and given its relationship with Pakistan, reinforced by the announcement that the CPEC is going to be extended to Afghanistan, was a big worry to us. Now, I'm not saying that the entire our concerns have been alleviated. But this is highly disruptive. This is going to alter or cause a major disruption between the flow of diplomacy and military collaborations which were taking place in grand strategy towards Afghanistan.